Spider-Man 3 is often treated like it's the black sheep of its trilogy. While it's true that Sam Raimi's previous two films in the series, 2002 Spider-Man and 2004 Spider-Man 2, are still widely regarded today as two of the greatest comic book films ever put to screen, I think the treatment that the third and final installment in the franchise gets is somewhat unjust. Now, am I suggesting that Spider-Man 3 is every bit the brilliant film that Spider-Man 2 is? No. There were a lot of factors that ultimately caused Spider-Man 3 to not hit the height of its predecessors, namely the behind-the-scenes problems between Raimi and the executives at Sony Pictures, which led to production of the film beginning before the script's completion, and the addition of a third main villain in the form of Venom. To put it bluntly, Spider-Man 3 is an awkward, goofy, and bloated mess of a film. But even with that said, I think there's still a lot of great stuff within it, and I think it's actually a better movie and a far more interesting movie than people give it credit for. So in this video, I want to discuss the central ideas and themes at the heart of Spider-Man 3, and what they tell us not just about this film itself, but the wider story at play throughout the entire Raimi trilogy. Specifically, I'm going to examine what Spider-Man 3 has to say about the idea of revenge, forgiveness, and learning to overcome your own mistakes and maintain a path to heroism. And why I think this theme actually helps make Spider-Man 3 a better movie than you might remember. One of the things that I think has helped make Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy feel so timeless and beloved is the heart and humanity at the centre of each story. At their core, all of these films tell incredibly human and relatable stories with incredibly fantastical characters, larger than life heroes and villains, but deeply rooted in everyday problems. Each of these three films have tackled these ideas in unique ways too. Spider-Man 1, for instance, is a movie about confronting and accepting responsibility, with Peter forced to grapple with his new responsibility as a superhero, learning the importance of using his powers to help others, and preventing others from feeling the pain he felt after losing Uncle Ben. The movie is also about identity and duality, with Peter's journey both as a hero and an orphan struggling with the loss of his paternal figure, being paralleled with the villainous Norman Osborn, both as an evil alternate father figure to Peter, and also his own troubled relationship with his son Harry. Spider-Man 2, likewise, is a movie about choice, and how the decisions that we make shape and define us as people. In this film, Peter and his mentor Dr. Otto Octavius are essentially mirrors of one another, but it's the choices that each one makes throughout the film that eventually drive them to become enemies. Spider-Man 2 is also a movie about sacrifice, and the difficulty of letting go of your own desires for the greater good, with Peter at first quitting being Spider-Man as it prevents him from having a personal life, before accepting his responsibility as a hero and eventually choosing to let Mary Jane go and sacrificing the life he wants for a greater purpose, while Dr. Octavius is ultimately redeemed and saved by Peter and sacrifices himself to save the day at the film's climax. Following on from these themes, Spider-Man 3 seeks to tell a story about revenge and forgiveness, and the almost tightrope-like struggle our characters find themselves balancing when they believe they've been wronged. This idea is exemplified through practically all of the main characters in the film, but Peter's arc throughout the film is maybe the best example of this at play with an individual character. The movie chooses to place Peter in a rather unusual situation. Spider-Man is finally accepted and loved by the city, so much so there's a huge parade thrown in his honour, and we see how this adoration for the web-slinger enlarges and fuels Peter's ego. Peter becomes more arrogant and unlikable the more Spider-Man is seemingly worshipped by New York. The parade sequence I mentioned earlier is a great example of his hubris on full show. And this is only exemplified once he comes into contact with the symbiote, turning the once plucky and likeable everyman into an arrogant, condescending and self-centered bully. One scene in particular which demonstrates this best is when Peter exposes fellow photographer Eddie Brock's photos as being fake. Peter belittles and humiliates Brock, taking great pleasure in tearing his co-worker down and feeling no remorse for the way he treats him. And when Eddie attempts to plead with Peter for forgiveness, Peter arrogantly responds, "You want forgiveness? get religion. Now, Eddie is by no means a saint in this film, but this interaction demonstrates just how far removed Peter is from the character that we expect him to be, with the symbiote acting almost as the devil on his shoulder, encouraging him to choose spiteful vengeance over forgiveness. This spiteful nature of Peter is later demonstrated when he invites Gwen Stacy out to a bar in which his former girlfriend Mary Jane Watson is now working at, with Peter intentionally causing a scene before a fight breaks out, where Peter accidentally strikes MJ down. This chilling moment almost sees time stop entirely, and serves to sober Peter up to the realisation of the person he's become. At this point, Peter couldn't be any further away from the man he was, and it's at this moment that he begins his path to forgiveness and redemption. After this sequence of the film, Peter is visited by Aunt May, where he explains the terrible things that he did, and Aunt May, acting as the angel on Peter's other shoulder, tells him that redemption comes when you start by doing the hardest thing. You forgive yourself. Peter, ridding himself of the symbiote soon after, demonstrates this. He chooses the angel on his shoulder, Aunt May, and the people that love him over the devil. It's not an immediate redemption for Peter either. Peter has to work and earn his forgiveness back from those that he's hurt, but by feeling remorse and showing sorrow for his actions, Peter Parker finally returns on the path to heroism once again. This is simply one example of how Spider-Man 3 attempts to discuss this idea of letting go and forgiving people for their mistakes, but there is another equally brilliant element of the film which questions this duality of forgiveness versus revenge head on. Say what you will about the overstuffed nature of Spider-Man 3 and its three main antagonists, but the Sandman is one of the most compelling villains in any comic book movie ever, and his journey throughout this film is a great example of how forgiveness influences the themes throughout Spider-Man 3. Flint Marko is introduced as the true killer of Uncle Ben, a revelation that starts Peter off on his quest for vengeance and begins his fall from grace. But from the very beginning, the way in which we're introduced to the character is incredibly sympathetic. In this film, Flint is a flawed man trying to atone for his past mistakes, while also seeking to do right by his sick daughter. As he says himself, "I'm not a bad person, just had bad luck." Flint, after his transformation into the Sandman after being caught in a particle accelerator, is confronted by an enraged black suit wearing Spider-Man, who ambushes him and seemingly kills the Sandman in an act of vengeance. So when Sandman ultimately resurfaces at the film's climax, aligning with Eddie Brock, now Venom, to seek revenge on Spider-Man for wronging them both, it represents Peter's bad actions and mistreatments coming back to haunt him. However, in the end, Flint realises that he doesn't really want revenge on Spider-Man, and instead opens up to Peter about the true nature of Uncle Ben's death, explaining how he only ever wanted the car and never intended to hurt Peter's uncle before his partner arrived on the scene, startled Flint, and ultimately caused the gun to fire in his hand accidentally. Sandman doesn't tell Peter this for forgiveness, but instead to clear his own consciousness and make peace with his past mistakes. And Peter, hearing this, empathises with the villain's own remorse, seeing himself and his own mistakes in Flint, and chooses forgiveness over revenge, and makes peace not only with the man who killed Uncle Ben, the driving factor in Peter's rage and quest to become Spider-Man, but also with his own demons inside, with Peter finally letting go of the pain that's driven him for so long, finding a sense of resolution and acceptance as he and the Sandman finally make peace. Peter and Sandman's journey to forgiveness and self-condolence isn't the only example of two characters struggling to forgive one another, with Peter's relationship with his former best friend Harry Osborn also demonstrating this greatly throughout the film. The movie opens with Harry dead set on revenge, succeeding his father as the new Goblin and attempting to kill Peter as payback for Norman's death in the original film. Following the pair's initial fight though, Harry suffers memory loss and forgets the cause of his anger towards Peter, and the pair become friends again. This though coincides with Peter's fall from grace, and by the time that Harry regains his memory and sets out for his quest for vengeance against Peter once again, the two are both at their most villainous points. The pair's second fight, staged at the Osborn family home, ultimately ends with Peter showing no remorse towards his former friend, catching and throwing back a detonated pumpkin bomb at Harry, which scars one half of his face. However, after Peter's self-realisation and journey to redemption begins and he rids himself of the black suit, he comes to Harry in need of help to rescue MJ from Venom and the Sandman. Though Harry initially rejects Peter's plea, unable to forgive his friend for the pain that they've caused one another, before Harry learns the truth behind his father's death and arrives to help Peter and save the day. Harry chooses to forgive and to let go of the anger that he's held towards Peter for so long, and in the end, ultimately sacrifices himself to save his two best friends. Not only does Harry redeem himself at this moment, but we truly see his journey from revenge to forgiveness come full circle, ultimately choosing to let go of his hatred and his quest for vengeance, but ultimately stopping himself from going down the same dark path that caused his father's death. In one sense, Harry died a lot like Norman, impaled in the stomach by his own glider, but in another, Harry died in a completely different way. He died a hero. In fact, you could argue that the only character in this film whose arc doesn't follow this structure is Eddie Brock, aka Venom. Now, Eddie is wronged by Peter, he's outed as a fake and has his career ruined as a result, but it's the ways in which Brock deals with this act that truly cements him as the film's main antagonist. After Peter rebuffs Eddie's plea for forgiveness, Eddie takes it literally, finding himself in a church where he comes up both with his plan to kill Peter Parker and bonds with the symbiote to become Venom. Brock, now driven by hatred, rage, and fueled by the symbiote, becomes the physical manifestation of Peter's worst tendencies and dark side. Eddie is essentially characterised as an evil version of Peter, or what Peter could become if he truly embraced the devil on his shoulder. Eddie's death at the end of the film comes from his inability to let go of his rage towards Peter, and the fact that instead of choosing to forgive, he instead feels emboldened and powered by his hatred, as he tells Peter, "I like being bad, it makes me happy." Brock ultimately can't let go of his pain and his need for revenge, and this contrasts Peter's redemption through remorse and forgiveness. The fact that Peter, Harry and Flint can all show remorse and forgive one another for their actions demonstrates the humanity and the good inside each of them, while Eddie's persistence to hold on to his anger eventually becomes his undoing and emphasises him as the real villain of the film, and the embodiment of how anger and hatred can corrupt a person when they refuse to let go of it. In the end, I'm not trying to convince you that Spider-Man 3 is some misunderstood masterpiece, but instead that I think there's more interesting ideas at play throughout this film than it's often given credit for. Despite the many problems that this movie may have overall, I find it fascinating that Sam Raimi sought to tell a story that explored the nuances between heroism and villainy, pushing Peter Parker to his lowest point and examining the dark path that revenge can lead a person down, and contrasting this with sympathetic and understandable villains such as Harry Osborn and the Sandman. It may be a flawed movie overall, but Spider-Man 3 is still a fascinating exploration into redemption and forgiveness, what makes someone a hero and a villain, and whether we're too far gone to ever be saved. It's not perfect, and it doesn't always execute these ideas the best, but part of that is kind of what makes it charming to me. It's a film about making and acknowledging mistakes, and with this in mind, there is something fundamentally relatable and human about Spider-Man 3 to me, and I think with the film's ideas in mind, maybe it doesn't deserve all the hatred that it seems to get. Maybe instead of being angry, we should all take on board the lessons that this film aims to teach us, choose forgiveness, and give this film another shot, because I think you might enjoy it more than you expect. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the little notify bell next to it so you stay up to date with all of the new videos we make. And there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy if you enjoyed this one. If you want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics, and if you want to help support the channel, there are links in the description to go and do so. It would be much appreciated. That's all for me. I will see you all next time, so until then, take care and keep reading.